So when it comes to textures, typically the rule is if something is messy or heavy enough, it typically, not always, but typically it's easier to repair. So this one is kind of a common texture with houses, let's say from the 60s or older. Not too much common texture in recent history. It's pretty busy. When it comes to like doing textures and you want it to look timeless, typically I always tell people do smooth. It looks good always. But this house is probably from the 30s, has an old crow's foot that has been painted a million times. It gives it a very washed out look. And it's makes it a little bit more difficult to do. Now there are different variations of crow's foot, or people call it stomp. This one happens to be pretty washed out. I have seen it not washed at all, which is, in my opinion, heinous. But these two photos I keep flip-flopping back and forth to. One is my repair, the other is the original wall that I was supposed to match. So the one that's more uniform looks painted is because that's the old wall and has been painted. The other one that's a little bit more gray, a little bit is actually the repair. Most of these walls were done end to end, and also on this wall I had to match a radius and blend it in with the bathroom to match, and also to match the existing areas. This was a renovation at some point in somebody's house. It was all painted, and they wanted to make it look like it had matched the rest of the house as well as the new areas that they had done, so that it looked the same throughout and you could not tell that it had been renovated and updated. So the first thing was to address the bathroom with the exposed clay block and to make the radius on the lower angle. The top angle was to remain crisp, so, and fill out some bad corners to make it look like it had a bead on it. So that's what I did initially, using a laser, and a lot of patience filled out the clay down to where the tile was going to be and hit the radius, replaced with the texture to match the existing. So this is kind of tricky. If you're going over paint, which I was, it's not going to work to go directly over the paint for like a whole wall. Sometimes you have to blend it for repair. But if you're going to do a entire surface, and it happens, like I said, to be a painted wall, the first thing you want to do is to skim the wall with a heavy coat of drywall mud, just to give it some kind of a suction for the second texture coat to stick to, so that it doesn't slide around when you go to wash it down. If your texture is not washed down, you do not need to do this, but this one was pretty washed down, so I needed something to provide some suction for the actual texture coat. Once your coat is reasonably dry, preferably the same day, but as you don't want it so dry that it sucks up and then you have a lot of bubbles, you also don't want it so wet that adding to it over the paint will cause it to bubble and delaminate. You don't want to add too much moisture. That's a no-no. At the same time, also it'll just end up tearing off when you go to mop it. So what you do is you skim it, again, relatively heavy coat, then you go around with the trowel and you put it on the wall and you pull it out, and you don't get too far ahead with your skimming, otherwise it won't work. And if it ends up not matching, you just put a little bit of extra material in your trowel, and then you keep making sure it's rough and random uniformly as best you can everywhere. I use a trowel. Some people use a stomp brush. Some people use, I've seen rollers used, but for me, I personally just use a trowel and pull it out. You should be left with like a spiky kind of look, which, like I said before, some houses actually, that's all they do. That's the texture. I think it's ugly, but if that's what you have to work with, then, you know, you make do with what you got and you just blend it in. But this house, like I said, was almost smooth. So you let it set up, but you don't let it get hard. You wait till it's like about to get hard and use a tile sponge and hit it in like rough and random directions just to soften it up a little bit. And depending on how much you want it soft, you might have to hit it a little bit early. You might have to hit it a little bit later. Hitting it early creates lines. Hitting it later makes it smoother. However, if you hit it early, you got to remember that you're going to probably have to drop back with that tile sponge and knock down the lines, so basically you're going over the same surface twice. And then when you're done, you should look with something like this, which is like an old world finished look. It is not that difficult. Can be a little bit intimidating if you've never done it before. This wall was the previous one that I had to add the radius in the lower corner and built out that corner so it looks like a bead. Pretty good. It turned out looking almost like it never happened. And now it's time for the painters to come in. That's it. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Comments below. This was done with drywall mud. One other tip I would probably go to tell you when you do it. When you do the texture coat, you want to do the actual texture with the same bucket that you skim it. So you want that to be the same. And also with drywall mud, plaster is a different story. You can mix a whole bucket, and if you move it along, plaster sets more gradually. Drywall mud tends to set quickly and all at once. So what I would say with the drywall mud, when you do it, to stick to maximum one bag per mix, or even probably even less, maybe a quarter of a bucket. But that, depending on your skill level as far as skimming, that might be a bit much. I'm obviously do this for a living, so I'll stick to a bag and I won't go any more, and I'll do maybe 2 bags before I drop back and start mopping it down. Another thing I would mention probably with textures like this is you can have errors in the field. You can have an error, a blemish, or a little bit inconsistency, but I would focus a lot of your time on the corners. Make the corners crisp and perfect, even if it's an old house. With one trick is to do opposite walls. That helps keeps the corners crisp, and then brush them. Otherwise, if I'm doing one wall after the next, I'll use my finger and I'll put mud in the corner of the finger and then take the sponge and then wipe the corner with the sponge, with a tile sponge. Not any sponge, tile sponges work the best, which we've found. And if you really wash those corners out well with your sponge and your finger, keep it nice and crisp, you can have the blemishes everywhere else. If the corners look good, the whole job looks good. If the whole job looks good except your corners are sloppy, then what basically that means is your whole job is going to look sloppy. This specific job had smooth ceilings and textured walls to match the existing all through the rest of the house. And as I said, this house is probably from the 30s and is a pretty common texture in its variations. And then when you're doing a repair, these happen to be, if you can do it from wall to wall, that's the best, because then you don't have the joint lines. It tends to smear if you want to paint, because you have to stop your patch and then take the texture onto the painted surface, and the painted surface is going to mop differently than where you have the drywall mud for previously, so you have to kind of be delicate with the areas over the paint if you're trying to blend it into like a huge wall that can't be done easily completely. But obviously you're going to sit there and you're going to babysit as it sets up, and then lightly sometimes pat it helps. Not wipe it, but pat it. Especially if it's like a gloss paint, this can be kind of difficult. Just play around. Worst case scenario, you sand it off and try again on those areas. Obviously you don't want to be doing too much sanding with this texture. And also the other tip I would do is to err on the lighter side. You can always add more texture. It is really tough to take off texture or sand it out. I think that's it as far as textures with crow's foot. And again, this is doing it with drywall mud to match an existing. Plaster is basically the same process, but doing bigger batches. And typically over plaster, you're going over a blue board. It does not work well over like a bonded painted surface. The same principle would apply. You'd have to base it, use like a base coat first, and then use your finish like a Imperial or a Excalibur or something like that. So hope that helps anyone out there who has any questions about repairing crow's foot. Let me know if you have any questions, comments below, and I'll talk to you next time.